everyone, and welcome to another episode of our currently unnamed podcast. If you have any name recommendations, please email us at rellyandava@gmail.com. We really need to find a name one of these days. Today we are blessed and honored to have Rabbi Dr. Vanessa Ochs with us from UVA. She is a renowned Jewish feminist scholar and much more, which she will tell you about in a moment. And we will be talking today about Lilith, who is a very, very interesting feminist character in Jewish history, specifically within feminist midrash. And midrash is kind of like an interpretation of Jewish texts, filling in gaps. I think of it kind of like the Jewish version of Greek mythology, like making explanations for things. I just wanted, before we get started, I have a cup here that my aunt just gave me, and it says, "We will dance on the graves of the patriarchy and drink the bitter tears of mediocre men." And I thought it was perfect for this episode and Vanessa Ochs being with us. So very excited to have you along with us.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Vanessa, for being here today. Also, I am on my sister's laptop today, so if I get any calls, it's my sister's middle school friends. Please ignore that. And then I have an icebreaker question for Vanessa. Vanessa, if you could be, oh my God, my sister is a little popular over here. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry if that comes up. I'm really sorry. Okay, if you could be one candy bar, or like chocolate bar or something, and why, what would it be?
Well, there's no question a Reese's peanut butter cup, because that is the most delicious thing in the world, and I would just be so proud to have peanut butter inside of me and chocolate on the outside, and I would just have really excellent self-esteem because of my great pride. But I wouldn't be lording it over other people. I would maintain it inside.
That's beautiful. I don't have as poetic of an reasoning, but I also would be a Reese's Pieces, mainly because I like to eat Reese's Pieces. So I'll just take, or not really Reese's Pieces, Reese's peanut butter cups, but I'll just take your poetic answer and say I think the same.
I think I'm going to go with a Kit Kat for now, because my two favorites are Reese's and Kit Kats, and I want to be a little original. But I guess they have such a satisfying crunch, and I think you can, it's a testament to the interesting parts of myself that come out when I'm put under pressure. I have a very interesting crunch that makes my life deeper and more enriching. So that's why I would be a Kit Kat.
I mean, we could talk about this all night.
Yeah, exactly. That's what happened in our first episode. We went too hard into the desserts. So we'll move on. Today, we're talking about Lilith, a character I was only introduced to very recently by Ava, actually. Like, I've heard of Lilith, but like, not in like, I didn't know Lilith was like a Jewish mythology figure until Ava introduced me to her. And then I started doing my own research, and actually this summer I did a theater writing workshop within the Bronfman Fellowship, and our theater teacher, Aaron, I think it's Henny is how the last name is pronounced, he actually wrote a whole play about Lilith. So I did a lot of writing exercises on Lilith, and I actually like came to really be fascinated with her as a figure, and like as kind of like how she's been like retaken by the feminist movement, and I was fascinated by that. So Vanessa, can you tell us a little bit about your Jewish feminist journey, and specifically with Lilith?
My feminist journey with So I was just talking to my husband about this the other day. I was wondering if being a rabbi was a possibility when I was growing up, if I would have become a rabbi, if it were a possibility for women. I'm not sure that I would have. I'm not sure when I was a young person, if I would have found it the most appealing thing. I wanted to go into the theater, but now that I am a rabbi, I think about how theatrical being a rabbi is, how much performance goes on, leading prayers, leading rituals, when you're an actor, you have to be very aware of the audience, and rabbis have to be extremely aware of either the synagogue or the people that you're with. So I did become a rabbi as very much as a grown-up person, and my first expressions as a Jewish feminist came as a writer, as a freelance writer, and probably I was most on the scene as a Jewish feminist when I wrote my book called Words on Fire, which is about the first generation of many Jewish women who were learned, some who still are, who are learned in Jewish sacred texts, who were teaching them primarily to other women. And no surprise, and this was set in Jerusalem, and no surprise, any number of these women were taught by their fathers, and they did not have brothers. So sort of the Yentl story, and the father did not advertise the fact that he was teaching Torah to his daughter. It was kept quiet, and then the daughter kept on learning and then teaching. So I think that was one place where I began to really grow as a Jewish feminist, where I saw these role models of very strong women who, despite the fact that their community had no interest in their being Jewish teachers and masters of sacred texts, that they said, I can do that. And that was very important to me. Another big part of my Jewish feminist journey concerns women of the wall. Soon after I wrote this book, I was asked by women who were the leaders in the Women of the Wall enterprise. It was very little enterprise at first. It's much larger right now. But they asked if I would help them organize and help them raise money and help write editorials, be part of the movement. And I had mixed feelings. Maybe I've shared this with you. I had mixed feelings because for me, the Kotel, the Western Wall, isn't necessarily the place where I yearn to pray. I'm more of a praying right here in my room or outside. And what these women wanted to do is they wanted to be sure that they had the right to pray together as a group of Jewish women with reading from a Torah, being able to wear a talit, being able to wear tefillin. And I, as an egalitarian Jew, raised in the conservative movement and generally finding my way in a variety of liberal expressions of Judaism, praying with women only, while it's a delightful thing to do, it's a very moving thing to do. And I was part of some of the earlier women's tefillah groups, incredibly moving experiences. This is not something that I feel like I don't want to. If I have to pray at the Western Wall, at the Kotel, I don't want to pray with a group of women in the women's section. That already feels uncomfortable to me. But my Jewish feminist sisters needed me. And sisterhood is powerful. And we would not be where we are as Jewish feminists right now if not for the fact that there are many of us, and we put our heads together, and we have agency, and we have done any number of things. We have found our way into systems that have excluded us, and we've also, and I think of the work of Judith Plasko, we say, something. We have to use our Jewish learning and our Jewish lives and Jewish experiences to create new ways of being feminist, being Jewish women. Or we might even go further than that and say that Jewish men and Jewish women are now creating new ways of expressing themselves as Jews that are not based on a binary gender, male, female. and that's incredibly refreshing. So it's been a long, beautiful journey. And the other day, my grandson, who's 11, said to me, "Grandma, what's your academic field? Jewish feminism, right?" And I thought, wow, that is a cool thing that he knows, that his grandmother Rabbi her academic field is Jewish feminism. I mean, what 11-year-old knows what Jewish feminism is? And he knew. It was very clear to him. And that's pretty satisfying that the world looks different right now. So when I teach Jewish feminism right now, as I'm doing at UVA, it's very different than when I taught in the 1990s, when it was a matter of opening up the book and saying, the books of halakha of Jewish law, and going, "Oh, this makes me angry. Oh, that one makes me. Oh, that one's nasty. That's nasty. How could they say that?" We're in a very different place right now, where we're beyond the, "Oh, isn't that nasty?" and we have to say, and now what? And now what do we do about Me Too in the Jewish world? What do we do about consent? What do we do about the ways that women rabbis are treated? The fact that generally they don't get offer the same kinds of high-level positions or get those big salaries if they are the CEOs of Jewish organizations. Lots of big issues, and the big issue in the paper today, in the Jewish papers today online, is sexuality in Jewish teenagers, and ways that perhaps girls are hypersexualized. A lot of stuff going on, and how exciting! How exciting that we're able to be engaged right now in these kinds of ways.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was amazing, and you touched on so many things that I think Relly and I have been thinking about, wondering about, struggling with in the past couple of months. Specifically with the now what, like there are these like very uncomfortable things in Jewish text. So what do we do now? How do we create the Judaism of the present and the future that feels like it centers previously marginalized voices, etc.? So I think that's the perfect segue into examining the character of Lilith. So I'll give a little background about kind of where Lilith came from in the traditional Midrashic sense. So in Genesis 1, there's the creation story, and it says that man and woman were created together. So there's this one being that's androgynous, or multiple genders, that's created at the same time. But then in Genesis 2, there's a discrepancy and a disagreement, which is that woman was created out of man. So maybe you've heard of the story that Eve was created out of the side of Adam, out of Adam's rib. So that's kind of inherently, in a lot of interpretations, disagrees with the first chapter. So Jewish scholars set out to explain this discrepancy. What accounts for the difference in how the two creation stories of humans are laid out in the Torah? How can the Torah disagree with itself? So out of this discrepancy comes the character of Lilith. And Lilith was basically the wife of Adam, the woman to man, before Eve. So she was the woman created alongside Adam, alongside man in the first chapter. And then somehow she leaves, she's gone. And in the second chapter, there's Eve, who was created out of the side of man. That's what I've learned out of my very limited knowledge. And I've only started my journey of looking at these texts and grappling with these ideas. So this is by no means comprehensive. But that's where traditional midrash comes from.
Yeah, and there's the original midrash about Lilith, as a figure. Her first time her name is heard is the Alphabet of Ben Sira. I don't actually know what year that was, but a very long time ago, essentially. And it was this male scholar wrote about this character of Lilith, and essentially what he wrote was there was Adam and Lilith before there was Adam and Eve, and they were in the Garden of Eden together, and Lilith essentially, in the actual text, it's that she wanted to be on top, so like in like sexual acts, but like in general, like also the metaphor behind that is that she wants to be equal to Adam. And obviously Adam doesn't really like that, and so she leaves the Garden of Eden, and when God calls back to her, she's like, no, I'm not coming back. And it's kind of like she's cursed to like kind of like become a demon, and there's some things that like some sources that she marries a demon, and then she also like tries to steal eldest children, that kind of thing, and she kind of becomes this like devil figure, whereas like Adam and Eve become this like perfect, and obviously they sin, but like more perfect than Lilith as a demon. And then that's the perfect segue into our feminist midrash version, the coming of Lilith. So Ava, you want to introduce that?
Yeah, so basically, like, the coming of Lilith is a feminist retelling by Judith Plaskow, who Vanessa mentioned earlier, and who was kind of a pioneer in Jewish feminism in her time, and in literary Jewish feminism especially. And she wrote this story called The Coming of Lilith, which is a feminist midrash. And it outlines Lilith's story. So it talks about how Lilith was born alongside Adam, and from the dust of the ground, and then basically like outlines the patriarchal structures within the story that lead to her leaving the Garden of Eden, and her further demonization. So God has he, him pronouns in this story, and God and Adam are kind of like the system of the patriarchy. So Adam doesn't like that Lilith wants to be equal to him in other ways and doesn't want to be subservient, and kind of consorts with God and is like, what should I do? What happens until Lilith leaves? And God creates Eve out of Adam. So then for a while, Eve and Adam had a good thing going for a time. Eve serves Adam in sexual acts. She lays beneath him. And meanwhile, Lilith is alone outside the garden, kind of isolated. And she misses companionship. And she's like every once in a while tries to break back into the garden. And every single time Adam just builds the walls higher, trying to keep her out. But one day, Eve catches a glimpse of Lilith, and Lilith sees Eve. And this is kind of like the sparking of the feminist awakening within the text, because seeds of curiosity and doubt, it says, begin to grow in Eve's mind. So Eve, who was before content with her subservient stature because she didn't know anything different, now like realizes there's someone else, there's something more than this life. And so they meet and they tell each other stories, and they kind of compare experiences, which I think plays back kind of this when this was written, it was situated in the second wave feminist movement, where women were being liberated through storytelling and telling stories to each other and comparing experiences, and realizing patterns of misogyny and the patriarchy within their lives. So that's immediately what that makes me think of. And Adam is puzzled, and he goes to God, and God is puzzled too, right? Like they don't understand. And then the last paragraph of the story, I'll read it to you. It's one sentence. It says, "And God and Adam were expectant and afraid the day Eve and Lilith returned to the garden, bursting with possibilities, ready to rebuild it together."
Beautiful.
I think that's the most beautiful line.
It's really stunning. Absolutely stunning. You know, when Judith was writing this midrash, she was at a place in her own feminism where the question of how do I remain a Jew and be a feminist? How do I reconcile this? What do we build? And she was part of a sisterhood of Christian women, part of a sisterhood of Jewish women as well. And from her experience of powerful sisterhood, she knew that there was another source of knowing, another source of being that was outside of Torah and that was outside the Jewish experience that she had growing up, that these ways of knowing and being could be the sources of new theologies and new rituals. And she knew too that while Jewish men have been sustained by Torah, by the Adam and Eve story, she was very aware too that this was a body of literature that treated women as you've described in your other podcasts, that has described women as the outsider, as the other, as the object and not the subject. And how could these stories ever be redeemed so that they could become holy for women? And how could women have a Torah when they are so maligned by the Torah that we've received? And Plaskow comes up with this brilliant idea, which is the idea of narrative, of storytelling, which is the same idea of our midrashists, which is to create new memory and to coronate those memories as sacred. When we speak about rabbinic midrash, we say, "Oh, the midrash." When we say Mishnah and Talmud, we call it oral Torah. I mean, this is the work of human beings, and our ancestors, our powerful male ancestors, have declared that it is as holy as the Torah. And while I don't know any Jewish feminist midrashists, writers, who've said my text is as holy and it should be, it should be seen as divine word, I don't know that anyone has ever said that. I think what these texts have created is new memories, new collective memories for communities of women and communities of men. And this very idea of thinking about Eve not as the wimp and not as the sinner and not as the curious girl who got slapped and now she has to give birth in pain. The idea that she was a woman who was awakened by her sister, and that the two of them, one didn't decide to stay inside and be oppressed, and the other chose to be outside and without community. They decided to rebuild, to breach the walls, and to rebuild the nature of their society. This story does leave a few loose ends, which is like, oh, and what do you do with Adam? And what do you do with God, who seems to be Adam's big buddy? So we don't have the happy ending yet, where there is, like in a Shakespearean play, where everyone's, well, actually in Shakespearean plays, usually there's a marriage that ends things, but where do we have some harmony for men and women? Where do we have mutual experience, mutual community? But Judith didn't put that in her story because that didn't matter then. That wasn't the essential. It was a story which reflected sisterhood, and it also reflected the power of a woman who defies the expectations and the social constraints. Interestingly, what do the midrashists do with Lilith is they turn her into a baby killer. The woman who wants to be equal, it's not like she can be a powerful mother. No, she has to kill and threaten babies. They have to make her the most vile person possible. in the Jewish imagination. I mean, when my little sister was born, my grandmother, before we brought her back from the hospital, my grandmother was running around the nursery, and she was putting this paper underneath my sister's mattress. And I said, "What is that?" And she says, "Oh, it's an incantation against Lilith, the demon." It's like, oh, no, I didn't know we did that stuff.
Yeah, just what I was talking about with Ava before we started recording was that I kind of see midrash in general. Like, I don't consider midrash, maybe this is like heretical, but I don't necessarily consider midrash at all as like it's not canon, you know, and people can't just decide this is the canon now. So like I was saying, now like I'm upon reflection after what Vanessa said, I'm like reconsidering what I said, but like I was like, I didn't like I think the story is beautiful and I love it as a story, but I was like, I don't necessarily know if I believe how believable it is, but the alphabet of Ben Sira is not necessarily believable either. It's both situations of someone making up the story and like deciding what happened. And I think seeing how it's changed and how a story has developed is really telling, because in the original story, Lilith is a demon and she's exactly what you're saying. Like the thing that like the way to like scare other women to be afraid of Lilith is to say, oh, she's going to kill your child, because like childhood and motherhood is like one of the most intense bonds of being a woman. And so I think the way it's developed, because I don't really love the idea of Lilith being a demon. I know a lot of people have like embraced this idea, which I understand why. It's like not being subservient, but I like the way it kind of develops here into a sisterhood, because Eve wasn't subservient either. Eve ate from the tree. Like, I think that's also a telling message. Like, thinking about that as like, yeah, Lilith wasn't subservient and she left, and neither was Eve. No one can be subservient fully. That's I think that's also a message there, is that even, yeah, and like I like the idea of like what Vanessa was saying, is that Eve is not the wimp. Eve is not the one who just listened and whatever, because she's still, even if this midrash hadn't happened and we hadn't read it, it's still Eve did not listen to Adam fully. And so I think that's also, I love this idea of like sisterhood. That's the strongest bond. And I don't know, that's why also I was telling Ava, I think like the last line is so telling. It's like they sit there and they're talking to each other, just telling each other stories. And also what in the part of the story is that Adam lies to Eve and he tells her that Lilith is a demon. And then when Eve sees Lilith through the fence and she sees, oh, Lilith is just a woman like me, there's someone else like me, they both see each other and they didn't even realize they were missing each other until this moment. I think it's such a, I'm rethinking it. I actually do really like this story, because who's to decide which midrash is more real? One written by a man,
right,
hundreds of years ago, or one written now that like I actually really enjoy and one that I can more relate to. And yeah,
I guess the way I would say is no story is real, but then stories are really real, and stories are really true. And sometimes the story that feels most real and most true is the one that we need to hear at a particular moment. So if we need to hear a story which is about leave, then we need to hear the story of Lilith exiting. If we need to hear a story about women's community, then we hear that one, or a story about rebuilding the world that we all live in together. I think the story that emerges from both the traditional biblical story and Judith Plasko's midrash is that both Eve and Lilith are curious. They're curious about realities that aren't present before their eyes. They're imagining a what if or what then to use your theme. They're imagining something, a structure that isn't there yet, and they're also figuring out. And again, in Judith's story, what can you do if you imagine together? How much more powerful you are if you can bounce the ideas off of each other, and be attentive to the different experiences that we have. And I think that's something that's very beautiful that comes out of feminist Judaism, is also a respect for the term that Rabbi Laura Geller uses, the Torah of our lives. That stuff happened in Eve's life, stuff happened in Lilith's life. All Adam does is name animals. It's just like, he's like Dr. Doolittle, like mouse, bunny, but Lilith, Eve, is to know. And that's an important thing to do. I mean, you guys are going off to college soon. Like, you want to, what an Eve thing to do, you know, to go in search of the tree of knowledge, which many would have said years ago that should be forbidden to women.
I think that's what I love kind of most about midrash. That's why midrash is one of my absolute favorite tenets of Judaism, is the realness in my life today. And I read the story and I read the last line, and I don't think it happened back then. I don't imagine them coming back to the Garden of Eden back then together, but I imagine it happening today. Like, by having this podcast, by having this discussion, like, we are returning to the garden, bursting with possibilities, ready to rebuild it together.
And it was real and true for Judith Plasko. She and the women of Benot Esh, of her Jewish feminist sisterhood, they together, you know, they and others who you know, they're students, and their students, you know, we are building on what they did through their relationships. You know, it takes relationship, really. That midrash really of Judas really takes relationship really seriously. Where certainly in the, you know, in the authoritative midrash, it's who's on top, who's on the bottom. Like, that's not relationship. You know, that's what goes on in a sock drawer. You know, the right sock. You know, some Marie Kondo kind of thing.
Yeah, and also I think the idea that, that's exactly what you were saying, that like this idea that like ambition is a bad thing, and specifically women being ambitious is a bad thing. Like, that kind of, you can see like Eve is ambitious, right? And that's considered like, no, like you women, you can't go beyond here, but like that's kind of impossible. You know, you always want, you know, like knowledge is power. You always want more knowledge. It's like enticing, you know. And so I think that's also an interesting, I don't really know what the answer is, but I think it's an interesting thing, like who's telling us that we can't be ambitious? Is it Adam? Is it God? Is there a difference? You know, like, are they, I hate this word, but like, are they in cahoots together? Are they working together? Like, I don't know. And I guess that's kind of the point. It's like what I was saying is that like, it's like our decision now, our interpretation now is what we get to decide. So like, I'm going to say, no, that's not God's intention. Maybe that was Adam's intention, was to be the oppressive force. It's very easy for me to decide that as a person who believes in God, that like Adam is the oppressive figure in the story and not God. Maybe that's not true, but I think for the sake of like my interpretation of it, that's what it has to be. And like, ambition isn't a bad thing. And I think the fact that like Eve is still this iconic character, people name their children after her, like, she's not evil. And I don't think Lilith is evil either, but I'm saying she's not, ambition is not a bad thing, even though it might seem like it is. It's, I don't really have an answer, or we're here in thought, because I'm just thinking of this now, but I think we have to decide it's not a bad thing. And like sisterhood, you know, sisterhood is the strongest thing, and ambition together is a fantastic thing.
Anyway, speaking from a religious studies perspective, patriarchies create the deity that maintains the patriarchal structure. There's a reason that men in patriarchal structures resemble the God in their systems. If, you know, we say in Az Yashir Moshe, Atushem Ish Milchama, God, you are a warrior. Well, in that society, the man who was a successful warrior was a man of power and honor. And hey, jeepers, he looks like the deity in that group. Funny coincidence. You know, very, very, very funny. And there's a reason. There's a strong back and forth, which is, I mean, one of the reasons that the feminist midrashists have been straining so hard to create images of a woman sustaining God, or now that we're no longer essentialists anymore, of a human sustaining God, a God that doesn't just affirm one way, one variety, one flavor of being human.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap this discussion up a little, and I'm going to read a poem by Enid Dame, who actually Vanessa got to meet. And Vanessa, I'd love for you to speak about that a little bit right after I read it. But this is kind of another feminist midrash in the form of a poem that Relly and I are in love with.
Me too, me too.
And Vanessa, we're all in love with. Kicked myself out of paradise, left a hole in the morning, no note, goodbye. No note, no goodbye. The man I lived with was patient and hairy. He cared for the animals, worked late at night, planting vegetables under the moon. Sometimes he'd hold me, our long hair tangled. He kept me from rolling off the planet. It was always safe there, but safety wasn't enough. I kept nagging, pointing out flaws in his logic. He carried a god around in his pocket, consulted it like a watch or an almanac. It always proved I was wrong. 2 against 1 isn't fair, I cried, and stormed out of Eden and into history. The Middle Ages were sort of fun. They called me a witch. I kept dropping in and out of people's sexual fantasies. Now I work in New Jersey, take art lessons, live with a cab driver. He says, baby, what I like about you is your sense of humor. Sometimes I cry in the bathroom, remembering Eden and the man and the God I couldn't live with.
Just another, I mean, that poem, like, take it in, process it, but, like, it's so beautiful, and, like, this is the only second time I'm reading it, but I think, again, it's the fact that Lilith is ambitious, and I think it's interesting here that it's not necessarily presenting Adam as, like, the devil or, like, the demon that he was presented in other stories, and instead as, like, he wasn't a bad person, just not someone she could deal with, which I think I kind of see myself in Lilith also, is that, you know, I want to say it's annoying, but I'm realizing that it's kind of like a patriarchal idea that questioning and, like, asking things back is annoying. It's not annoying. But, like, that would be me, you know, like, I can never take anything anyone says. I always have to fight back with people. I'm very stubborn. And I think I kind of see myself in the Lilith figure in that one. I think Lilith's a much more complicated being in this poem because she's crying that she could, but, like, I think also she's not, like, saying what could have been. She's saying, like, the person she couldn't be with, the God she couldn't be with, the Adam. She's realizing, like, that's just not who she could be with. You know, she cannot be subservient. She cannot be this certain person. And I think it's so beautiful and, like, stunning that she's presented as such a complex, you know, female character. But I just, and it's, like, in so few words. I don't know. It's so beautiful. Vanessa, I want to hear more about how you've met this poet before.
Oh, it was just very, you know, throughout my life, I've just been so blessed that to be in all kinds of settings where I was either, you know, on panels with, or in conferences or gatherings with all these amazing Jewish feminists. We were all figuring it out together. And once there was a gathering of poets and writers, and Enid Dame was there, and her husband was too. And I just looked at her. I knew the poem, and I just looked at the two of them. It's like, oh, they're the people in the poem. Somehow, I mean, there's a before and the after, and an after in the poem. There's, you know, there's 2 different relationships, and both seem very present in this man and this woman. Obviously, you know, no poet is writing just about her own life, but I saw how that these real people, these 2 very real people, held for me the world of their poem in their embodied nature. Really, she was a very gifted poet. Very, very gifted. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I always learn so much from the 2 of you, and that's something I always say about my students. I'm not one of those teachers who says I learn so much from my students. I learned so much from you guys, a lot.
Thank you so much for being here. I don't know, I think I forget how much fire and kind of love I have for conversations with you about Jewish feminism, and just interacting with these texts together is fantastic. So thank you so much for being here. Hopefully we can have you again at some point.
I hope so too. Bye to both of you. Be well. Shana Tova.